Right, let's get straight into it. This is a high-yield deep dive on the BASIL 3 trial, pitched at exactly the level you'll need for your FRCS academic viva. We're going to deconstruct this landmark paper methodically and precisely.
Okay, so we're going to follow a really structured critical appraisal. We'll kick off with the PICO, then dive into the methodology, the stats, the results, and finally, we'll cover its external validity and what it all means for our practice. First things first, let's nail down the clinical question. To do that, we'll use the PICO framework to be absolutely clear on what BASIL 3 was designed to answer.
So, the population, our P in PICO. We're talking about patients with chronic limb-threatening ischemia, or CLTI, from atherosclerotic disease. Now, the key thing here is that they all needed a primary endovascular fem-pop revascularization, and, crucially, they had to be considered suitable for all three of the trial's treatment strategies. That's a really important point.
All right, on to the interventions. The I, there were two of them. First up, you had drug-coated balloon angioplasty, DCBA, with the option for a bailout bare metal stent. The second arm was primary drug-eluting stent, or DES, implantation. And remember, both of these were targeted specifically at the femoropopliteal segment. And what were they comparing against? Well, the C was plain balloon angioplasty, PBA, also with bailout bare metal stenting allowed. You can think of this as the control, the baseline endovascular strategy that the newer drug-eluting tech was up against. Finally, the outcome, the O. The primary outcome was amputation-free survival, AFS. Now, this is a really robust, hard composite endpoint. It's defined as the time to the first event of either a major above-ankle amputation of the index limb or death from any cause. And of course, the analysis was done on an intention-to-treat basis. Okay, let's move on to the critical appraisals, starting with internal validity. So what was BASIL 3? It was an open-label, pragmatic, multi-center, Phase 3 RCT conducted across 35 NHS vascular units right here in the UK.
Right, here we've got a classic trade-off you see in procedural trials. On the one hand, a huge methodological strength. They used central randomization with minimization. This balanced the groups across 7 key variables: age, sex, diabetes, and so on. Really robust. But on the other hand, it couldn't be blinded. It was open label. And that, as we know, unavoidably opens the door to potential performance and detection bias. That's a key point to raise in any critique.
We also need to look at protocol adherence. The PBA arm did pretty well, 88% adherence, but look at the intervention arms. It drops to 76% for DCBA and 74% for DES. Now, why does that matter? Well, this level of non-adherence or crossover could absolutely dilute any potential treatment effect, essentially biasing the result towards the null. Something to keep in mind.
And there's one other thing about the methodology you've got to mention. Remember the recruitment was paused for a while, from late 2018 to 2019? That was because of that whole paclitaxel mortality scare. Now, the main consequence was that they didn't hit their original recruitment target, which of course affects statistical power. But, and this is the critical part, it doesn't actually compromise the integrity of the randomization or the internal validity of the trial itself.
Okay, let's get into the statistical analysis. For the primary outcome, amputation-free survival, they used a time-to-event model, specifically a Cox proportional hazards model, and they correctly adjusted for those minimization variables and for the different centers.
So let's look at the first key number. When they compared DCBA against plain balloon angioplasty for amputation-free survival, the adjusted hazard ratio came out at 0.84. And what about drug-eluting stents versus plain balloons? Well, the result was almost exactly the same, an adjusted hazard ratio of 0.83. Now, this is the really crucial bit. How do we interpret those numbers? A hazard ratio under 1 hints at a benefit, right? But the key is the confidence interval. And for both of these comparisons, the confidence intervals crossed 1. That means there's no statistically significant difference. And why 97.5%? Well, that's a Bonferroni-type correction because they were making 2 primary comparisons. And to their credit, the authors also checked the proportional hazards assumption, saw it was violated, and correctly ran a sensitivity analysis using flexible parametric models. The bottom line? It just confirmed the main result.
So let's move on to the results. What are the headline findings you'd need to state clearly in your exam?
The main takeaway is absolutely clear. For patients with CLTI having a fem-pop endo-revascularization, neither drug-coated balloons nor drug-eluting stents showed any superiority over plain balloon angioplasty when it came to the primary outcome of amputation-free survival. Full stop.
And this wasn't just about the primary outcome. The lack of difference was seen right across the board.
If you look at the secondary outcomes, major amputation rates, overall survival, MAL, MACE, even quality of life, they were all similar between the three groups. And importantly, there was no signal of any excess harm or serious adverse events with any of the strategies either.
Okay, so we have the results. Now we need to think about external validity and limitations. In other words, who do these results actually apply to? And how robust are they?
This is so important. The external validity here is very specific. These findings are about an endovascular-only approach for femoral popliteal disease in CLTI. You absolutely cannot extrapolate them to other situations. Think about BASIL 2. That was all about infrapopliteal disease, comparing endo first versus vein bypass first. Or BEST CLI, which was a straight shootout between bypass surgery and endo. BASIL 3 is asking a completely different question in a different anatomical segment.
So, what are the key limitations to mention? Well, there are 4 big ones. First, as we said, it was underpowered due to the recruitment halt. Second, the open-label design. Third, those non-adherence rates in the intervention arms we talked about. And finally, it was a long trial, and device technology moves fast. The study didn't really include many of the newest generation devices, so we have to be careful about applying these results to the latest tech.
Right then, let's bring it all together. What's the final verdict? What's the concise, punchy summary you'd give to an examiner?
First and foremost, BASIL 3 gives us no evidence to support the routine, blanket use of drug-coated balloons or drug-eluting stents over a simpler strategy of plain balloon angioplasty for fempop disease in CLTI.
And that has a really direct implication for our practice, especially in a cost-conscious environment like the NHS. It tells us that our choice of device should be driven by patient and lesion anatomy, and by cost, not by a default assumption that newer and more expensive is automatically better. So, to sum it all up, BASIL 3 is a methodologically sound trial. It's a definite pass in terms of its quality and its relevance. It is a fantastic example of a practice-informing negative trial. You know, it doesn't expand what we do, it doesn't give us a new shiny toy. Instead, it refines our practice by challenging our assumptions and pushing us towards a more evidence-based, value-driven approach. A truly important piece of work.